My dad demanded that I give my corneas to my blind sister. I gave him the truth instead. My dad called me last Tuesday, saying we needed to have a serious family meeting about my sister Haley's future. She'd been losing her vision for the past 3 years due to a genetic condition and was now completely blind at 26. I drove 3 hours to my parents' house, thinking we would discuss care options or possibly explore assistance programs. Instead, I walked into what felt like an intervention with my dad, my mom, my Aunt Ruth, and Haley, all sitting in the living room waiting for me. My dad started by saying Haley's doctor had found a potential treatment that could restore her vision, but they needed a cornea donor who was a close genetic match. He said they'd tested everyone in the family, and I was the only match. He said this was my chance to give my sister her life back. I asked about the waiting list for donor corneas, and he said Haley couldn't wait that long. Her condition was deteriorating, and this needed to happen within the next few months or the surgery wouldn't be viable. My mom was crying, saying how hard it's been watching Haley struggle, how she'd lost her job as a graphic designer, how her boyfriend left her, how she barely left her apartment anymore. Haley just sat there with her hands folded, not saying anything. I said I needed time to think about it and research the procedure. My dad's whole demeanor changed. He said there was nothing to think about. This was family. This was what siblings did for each other. He said I had 2 working eyes and Haley had none, and refusing to help would be selfish beyond belief. He actually used the word selfish as if I were hoarding something that belonged to everyone. My Aunt Ruth chimed in, saying she'd give her corneas if she were a match, that any decent person would. She said I should be grateful I could even help. I asked what would happen to my vision if I donated, and my dad said the doctor assured them I'd still be able to see adequately with one eye. Adequately. Like having depth perception and peripheral vision were just bonuses I didn't really need. He said people lived full lives with one eye all the time, and I was young and healthy enough to adapt. When I said I needed to talk to the doctor myself, he said I was wasting time Haley didn't have. That's when things got weird. I asked Haley what she thought, and she finally spoke up, saying she didn't want to pressure me, but losing her sight had taken everything from her. She said she understood if I couldn't do it, but she'd never forgive herself for not asking. My dad immediately jumped in, saying it wasn't really asking when the answer should be obvious. He pulled out his phone and showed me pictures of Haley from before, painting and traveling and smiling. Then he showed me recent pictures of her with her white cane, looking miserable. He said this was my fault if I let it continue. My mom said they'd already talked to the surgeon and scheduled tentative dates for next month. They'd put down a deposit they couldn't get back. They'd told Haley's friends the good news that she'd be able to see again soon. They'd bought her new art supplies for when she recovered. Everything was planned except for me actually agreeing to it. I said I needed to leave and think, and my dad blocked the door. He said I wasn't leaving until I agreed to help my sister. He said if I walked out that door, I was walking out of the family forever. He said he'd disown any child who could watch their sibling suffer when they had the power to fix it. My mom begged me to just say yes, that they'd support me through the recovery, that they'd pay for everything, that I'd be a hero. I pushed past my dad and left. The next 3 days were hell. They called constantly. My dad left voicemails saying I was killing Haley slowly. My mom texted pictures of Haley struggling with daily tasks. My aunt posted vague things online about family disappointment and selfishness. Other relatives started calling, asking why I wouldn't help my poor sister. Then I did something my dad didn't expect. I called Haley's doctor myself. Turns out there was no revolutionary cornea surgery scheduled. Haley was on the normal transplant list like everyone else, and would likely get donor corneas within the year. The doctor had never discussed living donation with my family because that's not how cornea transplants work for conditions like Haley's. You can't just take corneas from a living person for an elective surgery. The only time they'd even consider it is for emergency trauma, and even then, it's extremely rare and requires extensive ethical review. The doctor was horrified when I explained what my family had told me. I sat in my car outside my parents' house for 20 minutes, gripping my phone with the doctor's number still on the screen. My hands were shaking, but my mind felt weirdly clear and cold, like I'd stepped outside my body and could finally see everything without the fog of guilt they'd been pumping into my head for years. The porch light was still on, and I could see shadows moving behind the living room curtains, where they were probably waiting for me to come back inside and apologize. My phone buzzed with another call from my dad, and I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I drove the 3 hours back to my apartment instead of going inside to confront them, knowing I needed distance and a plan before I faced them again. The whole drive, my dad's voicemails kept coming through, his voice getting angrier each time, demanding to know where I went and accusing me of abandoning Haley in her time of need. By the time I crossed into my city limits, he'd left 8 messages, each one more furious than the last. My mom started texting around the second hour, asking where I was, saying we needed to talk, begging me to come back so we could work this out as a family. I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't respond to any of it. I got home around midnight and immediately started Googling family manipulation tactics and medical fraud, my laptop screen glowing in the dark apartment. Everything I read described exactly what just happened: the manufactured emergency, the emotional hostage situation, the financial investment designed to increase pressure, and I felt sick realizing how calculated it all was. There were articles about coercive control, about families who pressured members into organ donation through lies, about the psychological tactics used to make people doubt their own boundaries. I read for 3 hours straight, taking notes, bookmarking pages, feeling my whole childhood recontextualize itself with every paragraph. The next morning, I called my friend Travis because he'd known my family for years, but wasn't close enough to be manipulated by them. I told him everything, and there was this long silence before he said my dad tried to get me to give up an eye based on complete lies, and hearing someone else say it out loud made it real in a way it wasn't before. He asked if I was okay, and I started crying for the first time since I'd left my parents' house. Travis came over that afternoon with coffee and his laptop, and we spent hours documenting everything: the timeline of events, the specific medical lies they told, what the doctor actually said, the financial pressure tactics. He pulled up templates for documenting abuse and helped me fill them out with dates and direct quotes I could remember. He suggested I might need legal advice because what they did could actually be criminal fraud or coercion. My phone had 37 missed calls and dozens of texts from various family members by evening. My mom's texts alternated between begging me to come back and accusing me of being cruel to Haley, while my dad's messages were just pure rage about disrespect and betrayal. Aunt Ruth sent a long message about how disappointed my dead grandmother would be in me, how family was supposed to stick together, how I was breaking everyone's hearts by being stubborn. My cousin texted asking what was going on because my parents were saying I'd had some kind of breakdown. I blocked my parents' numbers temporarily because I couldn't think straight with the constant bombardment and immediately felt guilty for it, even though I knew that guilt was exactly what they'd trained into me. Travis pointed out that healthy families don't make you feel guilty for needing space to process lies, and that simple observation broke something open in my chest. I cried again, harder this time, and he just sat there on my couch letting me get it all out. 2 days later, I called the doctor back to ask if he'd be willing to document what he told me in writing. He was incredibly kind and said he'd been worried about me since our call, and he'd provide a written statement confirming that he never discussed living cornea donation with my family, and that such a procedure wasn't medically viable for Haley's condition. He asked if I was safe, if my family was harassing me, and I realized how serious this looked from the outside. He said he'd email me the statement by end of business day, and that I should reach out if I needed anything else. I reached out to a legal aid clinic that Travis found, and they connected me with an attorney named Mariana who specialized in family coercion cases. She listened to everything over the phone and said that while prosecuting family members was complicated, what they did potentially constituted attempted medical fraud and emotional abuse, and at minimum I should document everything in case I needed a restraining order later. She offered to meet with me that week to discuss my options. Mariana helped me draft a cease and contact letter to my parents, clearly stating that I knew the cornea surgery was fake. I had documentation from Haley's actual doctor, and I needed space to process their deception. The letter was formal and legal sounding, which felt safer than trying to have an emotional conversation they'd just manipulate. We included a warning that further harassment would result in legal action, and that all future communication should go through Mariana's office. She printed it on her firm's letterhead and we sent it certified mail so there'd be proof they received it. My phone rang 2 hours later while I was heating up leftover pasta for dinner. I didn't recognize the number but answered anyway because I thought it might be Mariana calling from a different line. My dad's voice came through, quiet and controlled in that way that used to make my stomach drop when I was 12 and knew I was in trouble. He spoke slowly, carefully, like he was explaining something to a child who wasn't quite getting it. He said I'd been listening to the wrong people, that outsiders who didn't understand our family had poisoned me against them, that someone must have filled my head with lies about the surgery because his daughter wouldn't turn her back on her sister like this. He kept asking who I'd been talking to, what they'd told me, why I was letting strangers destroy our family. I grabbed my phone with both hands because they were shaking, and I realized this was Aunt Ruth's number showing up on my screen. He deliberately called from her phone so I wouldn't know it was him. Travis had told me to record any calls from my family, so I fumbled with my phone settings while my dad kept talking. I got the recording started and he shifted into this different tone, softer and sadder, saying how much he loved me and how family was forever no matter what disagreements we had. He said I'd regret burning these bridges someday when I needed them and found them gone, that Haley was crying herself to sleep every night because her own sister had abandoned her, that my mom was devastated and couldn't understand how I'd become so cruel. Every sentence sounded caring on the surface, but felt like a threat underneath, like he was warning me about consequences while pretending to express concern. I mentioned that I'd talked to Dr. Kavanaugh and had his written statement about the surgery never being real. The line went completely silent for maybe 5 seconds, long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then the call just ended without another word. I stood in my kitchen with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to dead air, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next morning, I was getting ready for work when someone knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw my mom standing there in jeans and an old sweater, looking smaller and more tired than I'd ever seen her. She wasn't supposed to know where I lived because I'd moved since the last time she visited, but she must have gotten my address from somewhere. She called through the door that she needed to talk to me, that my dad didn't know she was here, that she'd driven all this way just to see me. Part of me wanted to leave her standing in the hallway, but another part, the part that still remembered her reading to me before bed and making my favorite birthday cakes, couldn't do it. I opened the door, and she immediately asked if she could come inside, her eyes already red like she'd been crying on the drive over. I stepped back and let her in, even though every therapy article I'd read said not to. She sat on my couch and started talking before I even sat down, saying they'd only wanted to help Haley and maybe they'd gotten some details wrong about the surgery, but their hearts were in the right place. I asked what details specifically they'd gotten wrong, and she said, well, the doctor had mentioned transplants at some point, so they thought living donation might be an option. I pointed out that Dr. Kavanaugh said he'd never discussed living donation with them at all, and she switched to saying maybe they'd misunderstood what he meant, that medical terminology was confusing, and they'd just been trying to understand Haley's options. I asked if the doctor had actually scheduled surgery dates, and she admitted he hadn't, but my dad had been researching surgeons who might do it. Her story kept shifting every time I asked a direct question, first claiming the surgery was real but simplified, then admitting they'd misunderstood some things, finally saying my dad had been trying to find creative solutions because the regular transplant list was taking too long. She never once said the words, "we lied," or "I'm sorry," just kept repositioning everything as a misunderstanding born from desperate parents trying to help their disabled daughter. I asked her directly if she knew the surgery wasn't real when they ambushed me at the house with the whole family present. She started crying harder, her face crumpling up like I'd slapped her, saying I was being cruel and interrogating her instead of focusing on how much Haley was suffering. She said she came here hoping I'd understand how scared they'd been about losing Haley completely, how they'd been willing to try anything, how families were supposed to support each other through hard times. I kept trying to bring the conversation back to whether she'd known the truth, and she kept deflecting to Haley's pain, my coldness, how disappointed everyone was in me. After an hour of going in circles, she left saying she'd tried her best and couldn't do anything more if I was determined to believe the worst about them. I sat on my couch feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, emotionally exhausted and more confused than before she'd arrived. Travis came over that evening after I texted him, and I walked through the whole conversation trying to figure out what had actually happened. He listened to everything, then pointed out that my mom had never actually answered a single question I'd asked. She'd just cried and redirected and made me feel guilty for asking. He was right, but realizing it made me feel worse somehow, like I'd lost both parents instead of just my dad. The phone call started 3 days later. My cousin Jessica called asking why I'd changed my mind about helping Haley after agreeing to the surgery, saying my parents were heartbroken about the lost deposit. I told her I'd never agreed to any surgery and there was no real surgery to begin with, and she got quiet, then said that wasn't what she'd heard. My uncle called the next day with a similar story, adding that I'd gotten cold feet at the last minute and left Haley devastated right before her procedure date. My dad's sister called saying she understood I was scared, but backing out after they'd made all the arrangements was incredibly selfish. Each person had slightly different details, but the same basic story where I was the villain who'd promised to help, then abandoned my disabled sister, and the specifics were wrong in ways that proved my parents were actively spreading a false version of events. Nobody mentioned that the surgery had never been real, or that I'd discovered the whole thing was fabricated. According to the family narrative, I'd enthusiastically agreed to donate my cornea. They'd scheduled everything and paid deposits. Then I'd cruelly changed my mind and disappeared. I called Mariana, and we drafted emails to the relatives who seemed most reasonable, including Dr. Kavanaugh's written statement proving the surgery was never medically viable and explaining that I'd never agreed to anything. I sent them to about 15 family members and waited to see who would actually read the evidence. About half never responded at all, just went silent after I sent the documentation. 3 cousins and 1 aunt apologized for jumping to conclusions and said they should have asked me directly before believing my parents. 2 relatives, including my uncle, actually got angry at me for sending the emails, saying I was airing private family business to outsiders and making my parents look bad by showing the doctor's statement to everyone. My uncle said that even if the surgery details were exaggerated, my parents had been trying to help Haley, and I was being vindictive by publicly humiliating them. It was like the truth didn't even matter to some people as long as it disrupted the family's preferred narrative. Work became harder to focus on because my brain kept replaying conversations and analyzing what people had said. I'd be in the middle of reviewing a report and suddenly remember my mom's face when she deflected my questions, or I'd be in a meeting and realize I hadn't heard anything for the past 5 minutes. Aiden stopped by my desk one afternoon and asked if I wanted to grab coffee, and something about the way he asked made it clear he'd noticed I wasn't okay. We went to the coffee shop across the street and he asked directly if something was going on. I gave him a simplified version, just saying my family had lied about a medical emergency to manipulate me, and now they were spreading false stories about what happened. He listened without interrupting, then shared that he'd gone no contact with his own family 3 years ago because of similar manipulation patterns. He said his parents had used his brother's addiction as a weapon to control the whole family, making everyone responsible for fixing problems they'd created, and he'd finally realized he couldn't have a relationship with people who saw him as a tool rather than a person. He offered to connect me with his therapist who specialized in family trauma and wrote down her name and number on a napkin. I called Dr. Estelle Medina's office the next day and got an appointment for Thursday afternoon. The waiting room had calm blue walls and soft chairs, and I filled out intake forms asking about my family history and current stressors. When she called me back to her office, I sat down and immediately started crying before she'd even asked me anything. I apologized for crying, and she handed me tissues and said this was a safe space to feel whatever I was feeling. I asked if I was crazy or overreacting, if maybe my parents really had just misunderstood the medical situation, and I was being too harsh. She asked me to walk through exactly what had happened, and I told her everything, from the ambush meeting to discovering the surgery was fake to my mom's deflecting conversation. She listened carefully, and then introduced me to terms I'd never heard before: gaslighting and enmeshment and narcissistic family systems. She explained that gaslighting was making someone question their own reality, which was exactly what my parents were doing by claiming they'd just misunderstood medical information when they'd actually fabricated an entire surgery. She said enmeshment was when family boundaries were so blurred that individual needs got sacrificed for the family unit, and I'd been trained since childhood to prioritize Haley's needs over my own well-being. Suddenly, I had language for things I'd felt my whole life but never been able to name. I went back for my second session and then my third, and during that third appointment, Dr. Medina asked me to describe other times my family had used similar pressure tactics. I started talking about the scholarship incident, how I'd gotten a full ride to a university 4 hours away, but my parents said I needed to stay local to help with Haley, who was starting to lose her vision. They'd made it sound like a reasonable request, like any good sister would want to be nearby during such a difficult time, and I'd turned down the scholarship without really questioning it. Then I remembered how my college fund had been redirected to Haley's medical expenses without anyone discussing it with me first, just my dad sitting me down junior year and explaining that Haley needed the money more, and I'd understand when I was older. I'd wanted to study abroad in Spain my sophomore year, and my mom had cried saying it was selfish to leave the family when Haley was struggling, that I should be grateful I could see the world while my sister was going blind. I'd normalized all of it as reasonable family sacrifice, the kind of thing siblings did for each other, but sitting in Dr. Medina's office listing them out loud made me realize it was a pattern going back years. Every time I'd wanted something for myself, there'd been a reason why Haley needed it more, why I was being selfish for even asking, why a good daughter and sister would choose differently. I spent another week keeping my parents blocked, letting the silence grow between us until it felt less like avoidance and more like actual space to breathe. Then one night I sat on my couch with my phone in my hands and unblocked both their numbers. My heart hammered against my ribs as I typed out the message, deleting and rewriting it 3 times before I got it right. The final version was short and clear, no room for them to twist my words or claim they misunderstood. I wrote that I knew the surgery was fake, that I had medical papers from Dr. Kavanaugh proving it, that I needed 6 months of no contact to process what they'd done, and that any more harassment would mean I'd get a restraining order. My fingers shook when I hit send, and I immediately turned my phone face down on the coffee table like I could hide from whatever came next. My dad's response arrived in under 3 minutes. The notification lit up my screen and I grabbed the phone before I could stop myself. His text was a full paragraph, no punctuation, just a stream of words calling me dead to him, saying I'd chosen strangers over family, that I was spitting on everything he'd sacrificed to raise me. He said I was a liar and a traitor, and he hoped I'd live with the guilt of abandoning Haley when I could have saved her. The words blurred together as I read them twice, then a third time, waiting to feel the crushing guilt he clearly expected. Instead, I just felt tired and sad, like watching someone destroy their own life, and knowing there was nothing I could do to stop them. My mom's texts started coming in right after. A flood of crying emojis and short messages asking how I could do this, how I could be so cruel, how I could throw away my family over a misunderstanding. She sent a picture of Haley looking lost and alone, then another message saying I was breaking her heart. I turned my phone off completely and went to bed, and for the first time in weeks, I slept through the entire night. 2 days later, Haley texted me from her own number, and I stared at her name on my screen for a full minute before opening the message. Her text was different from our parents', softer and more careful, starting with her saying she knew things had gotten complicated. She wrote that our parents had maybe exaggerated some details about the surgery, that everyone was desperate and scared, that she was really struggling with being blind and thought I'd want to help her. She said she understood I was angry, but hoped we could work through this as sisters. The whole message felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced it, or maybe even had someone else read it first. I could hear my mom's voice in certain phrases, the way Haley framed everything as a misunderstanding instead of a lie, the way she made it about her suffering instead of their deception. I realized she'd been coached on exactly what to say, probably sitting at the kitchen table with our parents going over every word to make sure it would push the right buttons. I let her message sit for a day while I talked to Dr. Medina about how to respond. She helped me see that I needed to ask Haley direct questions instead of letting her control the narrative with vague apologies that weren't really apologies. So I typed back a single question, no extra words to soften it or give her room to dodge. I asked if she knew the cornea surgery wasn't real when we had that family meeting at our parents' house. I hit send and watched the message change to delivered, then read, and then I waited. Hours passed with no response, then a full day, then 2 days of complete silence that felt louder than any answer she could have given. When her reply finally came through, it was long, several paragraphs of explanation that somehow never actually answered what I'd asked. Haley wrote about how her blindness made her dependent on our parents to explain medical information, how she trusted what they told her about treatment options, how she was a victim of the situation too. She described how scared she was all the time, how she couldn't work or drive or do any of the things that used to make her feel like herself. She said she'd been desperate enough to believe anything that offered hope. And if our parents had bent the truth, it was because they loved her and wanted to fix things. The whole message was designed to make me feel sorry for her, to shift focus away from the lies and onto her suffering, and I read it 3 times, looking for any sentence where she actually answered my question. She never did. She never said yes, I knew, or no, I didn't know, just filled paragraphs with context and excuses that were meant to make the question itself seem cruel. I showed the text to Travis the next time he came over, and he pointed out what I'd already started to see, that Haley's non-answers were their own kind of answer. Travis pulled out his laptop and suggested we research Haley's actual condition, find out what her real prognosis was instead of trusting anything our parents had said. We spent an evening going through medical websites and patient forums, learning about the genetic disorder that had stolen her vision. Travis found support groups for people with the same condition, and I created an anonymous account, my username just a string of random letters so no one could trace it back to me. I posted a simple question asking if anyone had heard of living cornea donation as a treatment option, keeping my language vague enough that I wasn't sharing family details. The responses started coming in within hours. Multiple people confirmed it wasn't a real treatment, with several members sharing stories about desperate family members who'd fallen for scam clinics or misunderstood what legitimate transplant waiting lists actually meant. One person wrote about their aunt who'd spent thousands on a fake treatment center that promised miracle cures, and another described how their father had pressured them about living donation before their doctor explained it wasn't medically possible. Reading their experiences made my chest tight. This mix of validation that I wasn't crazy and grief that my family had put me through something other families had survived too. I brought all the research to my next session with Dr. Medina, spreading printouts across her coffee table like evidence in a trial. She read through the forum posts and medical articles, then looked at me with this expression that was both sad and proud. She helped me process that Haley was caught in the middle, both a victim of our parents' manipulation and someone who'd chosen to participate in it. Dr. Medina said I could have compassion for how hard Haley's life had become while still maintaining boundaries about the lies, that those two things didn't cancel each other out. She pointed out that Haley's non-answers and deflections were manipulation tactics too, learned behavior from growing up in the same house I did, watching our parents twist reality until everyone was too confused to hold them accountable. The session left me feeling clearer, but also lonelier, accepting that even my relationship with Haley might be too damaged to save. That weekend, I forced myself to try something new, something that felt vulnerable and scary in ways that had nothing to do with my parents. I joined a support group for adults dealing with family estrangement that met in a church basement across town. Walking into that room full of strangers felt like admitting my family was really broken, not just going through a rough patch we'd eventually fix. Everyone sat in a circle of mismatched chairs, and we went around introducing ourselves, first names only, sharing brief versions of why we were there. When my turn came, I said my name and that I'd recently cut contact with my parents after discovering they'd lied about a medical emergency to manipulate me. My voice shook on the last words, and I had to stop talking before I started crying in front of people I'd just met. The woman next to me reached over and squeezed my hand, and when it was her turn, she shared how her family had tried to pressure her into donating a kidney based on exaggerated medical urgency. She described the guilt trips and the accusations of selfishness, the way they'd made her feel like a monster for questioning whether her brother really needed emergency transplant surgery. She'd eventually discovered through her brother's actual doctor that he was on a standard waiting list and not in immediate danger, that her parents had manufactured the crisis to make her agree faster. The parallels to my own story were so exact that tears started running down my face before I could stop them, and I cried through the rest of her story and through the next 3 people sharing. By the end of the meeting, I felt wrung out but less alone, surrounded by people who understood that sometimes the family you're born into is the family you need to walk away from. A few days later, a certified letter arrived at my apartment, my parents' names in the return address corner making my stomach drop. I signed for it with shaking hands and carried it inside, staring at the official-looking envelope for 20 minutes before I could make myself open it. Inside was a letter from a lawyer threatening to sue me for emotional distress and defamation because I'd shared Dr. Kavanaugh's statement with relatives. The legal language was dense and intimidating, full of phrases about damages and liability that made it sound like I'd committed some serious crime. I immediately called Mariana and read her the whole thing over the phone, my voice getting higher and more panicked with every paragraph. She listened quietly, and then said exactly what I needed to hear. That this was a classic intimidation tactic with no legal merit. That truth was a complete defense against defamation, and I had documentation proving everything I'd said was accurate. She told me to make copies of the letter and add it to my file as evidence of continued harassment, that it actually strengthened my case if I ever needed that restraining order. My cousin Sarah called me the next week, her voice tight and uncomfortable in a way that made me brace for bad news. She said she needed to tell me something I probably didn't want to hear, that our parents were spreading a new story through the family. They were telling people I'd had a mental breakdown, that I was making false accusations against them because I wasn't stable, and they were pointing to my therapy attendance as proof I was mentally ill. Sarah said she didn't believe them, but thought I should know what they were saying, especially since some relatives were taking their word for it. I thanked her for telling me and hung up, then sat on my bathroom floor feeling a rage so pure it made my hands shake. They'd done everything else and I'd survived it, but weaponizing my healing process felt like a betrayal on a different level. I'd started therapy to process their abuse, and now they were using it as evidence that I was the problem, twisting my attempt to get healthy into ammunition against me. Work became the only place where I felt normal, where I was just competent and professional, and nobody knew about the disaster my personal life had become. I threw myself into projects with an intensity that probably wasn't healthy, staying late and volunteering for extra assignments because going home meant sitting with thoughts I wasn't ready to process. Aiden noticed the change, the way I'd gone from distracted and withdrawn to almost manic with productivity. He started checking in during lunch breaks, not asking directly about what was wrong, but making sure I actually ate instead of working through meals. He'd swing by my desk with coffee or drag me outside for walks around the building, casual enough that it didn't feel like pity, but consistent enough that I knew he was worried. I was grateful for his presence without being ready to explain why I needed it. 3 months after the initial confrontation, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, had gotten cautious about unknown callers after my mom's ambush visit, but something made me pick up anyway. Haley's voice came through the speaker, crying hard enough that I could barely understand her first words. She said our parents were driving her crazy, that the house was tense and miserable every single day, that our dad was angry all the time and our mom was depressed and barely getting out of bed. She said she couldn't handle being in the middle of everything anymore, that the silence and the fighting were suffocating her, that she needed me to come back and fix things because she didn't know how much more she could take. I listened to her sob and felt my heart split between the sister I'd grown up with and the person who'd sat silent while our parents tried to steal my vision based on lies. I told her none of this was my fault. I didn't create the situation by discovering their lies. They created it by lying in the first place. I wasn't responsible for fixing the consequences of their choices. Haley's voice went sharp and angry through the phone speaker. She said I was being selfish and self-righteous, that I was punishing her for something our parents did. She said she was the one suffering now because of my stubbornness, that the house was a nightmare to live in, and I could fix it by just coming back and letting things go back to normal. I realized in that moment she still didn't see herself as having any part in the deception. She'd sat there silent during that whole intervention, let them lie about the surgery, played the victim while they tried to manipulate me into giving up my vision. But in her mind, she was just caught in the middle, an innocent bystander to our parents' scheme. I told her I needed to go and hung up before she could say anything else. My next therapy session with Estelle happened 2 days later. I told her about Haley's call and how she'd positioned herself as another victim of our parents' behavior. Estelle listened and then started explaining patterns in family systems, how dysfunction gets passed down through generations like genetic traits. She said my dad probably learned these manipulation tactics from his own parents, that he grew up in a system where coercion and guilt were normal tools for getting what you wanted. She explained that families like mine often organize themselves around protecting the most fragile member, and everyone else's needs become secondary. Haley's blindness made her the fragile one, so the whole family structure bent around keeping her comfortable, even if it meant sacrificing me. Estelle said breaking these patterns usually means getting scapegoated as the crazy one who won't play along anymore. The family needs someone to blame for the discomfort of change, and that person is usually whoever starts demanding honesty and boundaries. I was that person now. She said it was lonely but necessary, that staying in the dysfunction to avoid being the bad guy just meant letting the pattern continue into the next generation. 3 days after that session, I was scrolling through social media during my lunch break when I saw a shared post from one of my mom's friends. It was a GoFundMe campaign for Haley's medical expenses. The description made my stomach drop. It talked about Haley's struggle with blindness, mentioned a potential treatment that could restore her vision, and heavily implied that family circumstances had made it impossible to pursue the surgery. The wording was careful, never directly saying I'd backed out, but anyone reading it would assume some family member had failed to help. The campaign had raised almost $3,000 in less than a week. Comments from friends and distant relatives filled the page, offering prayers and small donations, saying how terrible it was that Haley couldn't get the help she needed. I sat in my car staring at my phone screen, feeling sick. They were crowdfunding based on the same lies they'd told me, getting money from people who had no idea the surgery was fake. I took screenshots of everything and texted them to Mariana and Estelle, asking what I should do. Mariana called me back within an hour. She said this was actual fraud, not just family manipulation. They were soliciting donations based on false medical information, which violated GoFundMe's terms and possibly state fraud laws. She said I had documentation from Dr. Kavanaugh proving the surgery wasn't real, which meant I could report the campaign and likely get it taken down. But she also warned me it would cause a massive explosion in my family. My parents would know I was actively working against them, not just maintaining distance. Estelle said something similar when I brought it to therapy that week. She asked if I was prepared for the consequences of exposing them publicly, even if what they were doing was wrong. I thought about all those people donating their money based on lies, about my parents profiting from the same scheme they'd tried to use on me. I told them both I wanted to report it. Mariana helped me file the fraud report with GoFundMe's support team. I submitted Dr. Kavanaugh's written statement, the timeline of events and screenshots of my parents' messages, trying to pressure me into the fake surgery. The legal aid clinic added a letter explaining the situation from their perspective. Then I waited. For 6 days, nothing happened, and I started wondering if GoFundMe would even care. Then the campaign disappeared from the site. Just gone, with a message saying it had been removed for violating community guidelines. Mariana told me later that my parents had been required to refund all donations, that GoFundMe had flagged their account to prevent future campaigns. My dad's response came through in a flood of messages from his email, since I still had him blocked on my phone. He said I'd destroyed the family's reputation, that everyone would think they were scammers now, that I'd humiliated them in front of the whole community. He said I was vindictive and cruel, that I'd gone out of my way to hurt them when they were just trying to help Haley. The messages got angrier and less coherent as they went on. My mom sent shorter messages saying she couldn't believe I'd do this, that reporting them to GoFundMe was taking things too far, that I was tearing the family apart over pride. The following Tuesday, our receptionist called my desk phone saying someone was in the lobby asking for me. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I went downstairs confused. My mom stood near the entrance looking smaller than I remembered, her face tired and sad. She didn't try to approach me when I came through the security door. She just walked over, handed me a thick envelope, and left without saying a word. I stood there holding it, watching her walk to her car in the parking lot. The envelope had my name written on the front in her looping handwriting. I took it back upstairs and put it in my bag without opening it. I couldn't deal with whatever was inside during my workday. That night, I sat on my couch and pulled out the envelope. 6 pages of notebook paper covered front and back with my mom's handwriting. It was the closest thing to honesty I'd gotten from either parent. She admitted my dad had gone too far with the surgery plan, said he was desperate to help Haley, and convinced himself the ends justified the means. She wrote that she went along with it because keeping peace with him is how she survives their marriage, that disagreeing with him openly makes life unbearable. She said she knew I was angry, but begged me to understand they did everything out of love for Haley. The letter talked about how hard it's been watching Haley struggle, how helpless they felt, how the fake surgery seemed like a way to motivate me to help without understanding how wrong it was. She ended by saying she missed me and hoped I'd come back to the family someday, that she understood if I needed time but wanted me to know she loved me. I read it twice, then put it back in the envelope and cried for 20 minutes. Not because it changed anything, but because it was so close to what I needed and still so far away. I brought the letter to my next therapy session. Estelle read it carefully, then looked at me and said it was more honest than previous communication, but still basically an excuse rather than an apology. My mom explained their behavior but never took actual responsibility or acknowledged the harm they'd caused me. She said she went along with my dad's plan because it was easier than standing up to him, which meant she chose her own comfort over my well-being. The letter asked me to understand their motivation, but didn't offer to change anything or make amends. Estelle helped me see that understanding why someone hurt you doesn't mean you have to accept a continued relationship with them. You can have compassion for their circumstances while still protecting yourself from their behavior. My mom was trapped in her own dysfunction, but that didn't obligate me to stay trapped with her. 4 months after the initial confrontation at my parents' house, I noticed I was sleeping through the night again. I could focus at work without my mind constantly spinning through family drama. I made plans with friends on weekends instead of staying home feeling depressed. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes expecting angry messages. The grief still came in waves, hitting me at random moments when I'd remember something from childhood or see a family doing normal things together. But it wasn't drowning me constantly anymore. I was starting to imagine a future where I was okay without them, where their absence was just part of my life instead of an open wound. I went to work, came home, saw friends, went to therapy, lived my normal life. Some days I barely thought about them at all. Haley's text came on a Wednesday afternoon. She said she was getting corneas from the transplant list within the next 2 months, that her surgery was scheduled for early next month, and she wanted me to know even though I didn't care about her anymore. The message was clearly designed to make me feel guilty, the final phrase an accusation wrapped in information. I sat with my phone for a few minutes, then typed back that I was genuinely happy her surgery was scheduled and wished her a smooth procedure and full recovery. I meant it. Whatever had happened between us, I didn't want her to stay blind. She read the message immediately but didn't respond. I put my phone away and went back to work. That Saturday, I met Travis for coffee at the place near his apartment. We'd been doing this every few weeks since everything happened, him checking in and me updating him on the latest family drama. But this time felt different. I told him I thought I was ready to move forward with my life instead of just processing the past. He asked what that looked like, stirring sugar into his coffee. I realized as I answered that I wanted to help other people dealing with family manipulation, maybe volunteer with the legal aid clinic where Mariana worked, or facilitate support groups for people going through similar situations. I wanted to take everything I'd learned and use it, so other people didn't feel as alone as I had. Travis smiled and said that sounded exactly right, that turning pain into purpose was how people survived things like this. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about practical steps, him helping me research volunteer opportunities and draft an email to Mariana about getting involved with the clinic. Mariana sent me information about a family rights organization the following week, along with a note saying they needed volunteers for their helpline. The training was 4 sessions, 2 hours each, covering how to recognize coercion tactics, what resources existed for people in crisis, and how to provide support without overstepping boundaries. I sat in a conference room with 8 other volunteers, listening to case studies that sounded like my own life. The facilitator talked about families who used medical emergencies to manipulate members, about financial pressure tactics, about the weaponization of guilt and obligation. I took pages of notes, underlining phrases that described exactly what my parents had done to me. During the 3rd session, we practiced taking calls with role-play scenarios. I played the caller first, describing a situation where my brother needed a kidney, and my parents were threatening to disown me if I didn't donate. The volunteer playing the helpline counselor validated my feelings and asked about my own health concerns, and I started crying without meaning to, because nobody in my actual family had asked about my well-being during the whole cornea situation. The facilitator paused the exercise and checked if I was okay, and I explained that this was exactly what had happened to me, just with corneas instead of a kidney. She nodded and said that's why peer support was so powerful, because we understood from the inside what manipulation felt like. My first real shift on the helpline came 2 weeks after training ended. I logged into the system from my apartment, headset on, feeling weirdly nervous about talking to strangers about their family problems. The first call was someone asking about resources for elderly care, which I handled easily by reading from the resource list. The second call was a young woman named Jessica, whose voice shook as she explained that her family wanted her to drop out of college to take care of her sick grandmother full-time. Her parents said she was being selfish by prioritizing her education over family needs, that her grandmother had sacrificed everything for them and deserved better than being abandoned to paid caregivers. Jessica kept saying maybe they were right. Maybe she was being selfish, and I recognized every single manipulation tactic from my own experience. I told her that caring about her education didn't make her selfish, that she could love her grandmother and still have boundaries about her own life. I explained that guilt was a tool manipulative families use to control people, and that real love didn't require her to destroy her future to prove her loyalty. I gave her information about family medical leave programs, about support groups for caregivers, about how to set boundaries without cutting off contact completely. She cried and thanked me, saying nobody had told her it was okay to want her own life, and after we hung up, I sat in my apartment crying too, because I wished someone had said those exact words to me a year ago. I drove to my therapy appointment with Dr. Medina the next afternoon, still thinking about Jessica and how trapped she'd sounded. Estelle asked how the helpline work was going, and I told her about the call, about recognizing myself in this stranger's situation. She said that was both the hardest and most healing part of peer support, seeing your own pain reflected in someone else's story. We started talking about what healthy relationships actually looked like, and I realized I had no framework for that, because my family had been broken for so long. Estelle pulled out a worksheet about relationship patterns, and we went through it together. Healthy love meant respecting boundaries, not punishing people for having them. It meant accepting no without retaliation. It meant supporting someone's growth even when it was inconvenient for you. Every item on the list was the opposite of how my parents operated, and I felt this weird mix of grief and relief seeing it written out so clearly. She asked me to start noticing green flags in my other relationships, the ways friends and coworkers showed actual care without strings attached. I downloaded a dating app that weekend, partly because I was lonely, and partly because I wanted to practice interacting with people who didn't know anything about my family mess. My profile was carefully vague, mentioning my job and hobbies, but nothing about the last year of my life. I went on 3 dates in 2 weeks, all awkward in different ways, but also kind of fun because I got to be just a normal person making small talk over coffee. The third guy, Mark, was easy to talk to, worked in software development, liked hiking. On our second date at a Thai restaurant, he asked about my family in that casual way people do, and I felt my stomach tighten. I gave him the line I'd been practicing with Estelle about how we weren't close and I didn't see them much. He just nodded and said that was fair, some families were complicated, and then he changed the subject to ask about my favorite hiking trails. The fact that he didn't push for details or try to fix it felt completely revolutionary, like maybe I could date someone without my family drama becoming the center of everything. 5 months had passed since the confrontation at my parents' house when my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin Sarah. We'd been close as kids, drifting apart as adults got busy with their own lives, but I'd always liked her. Her message said she'd been thinking about our last conversation, the one where I'd tried to explain why I couldn't donate my corneas, and she'd seemed skeptical. He said my parents' version of events had never quite made sense to her, and the more she thought about it, the more questions she had. She apologized for not reaching out sooner and asked if we could get coffee and talk. I stared at the message for a long time, surprised by how much her belief mattered to me. I'd gotten used to being the family villain, had accepted that most relatives would side with my parents, but having someone actually question their narrative felt like a gift I hadn't expected. I texted back suggesting a coffee shop halfway between our apartments, and we set a date for that Saturday. Sarah was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 lattes waiting. She hugged me hard and immediately started apologizing for not questioning things sooner, for accepting my parents' story without pushing for my side. I sat down and told her everything, pulling up Dr. Kavanaugh's statement on my phone, showing her the timeline of events. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from confusion to anger as the full picture emerged. Then she started sharing her own stories about my parents, things I'd never known. She talked about being pressured to lie for them when I was younger, covering up when they'd forgotten important events or made promises they didn't keep. She described watching them twist situations to avoid taking responsibility, always finding someone else to blame when things went wrong. She mentioned family conflicts where she'd felt forced to choose sides, where neutrality wasn't allowed, and questioning their version of events meant being frozen out. She said watching me set boundaries had given her permission to examine her own relationship with them, to recognize patterns she'd been ignoring for years. We talked for 3 hours, our lattes going cold, the coffee shop filling and emptying around us. Sarah mentioned that Haley's cornea transplant surgery had happened 2 weeks ago and had gone well. She was regaining vision gradually, doing physical therapy to adjust to seeing again, and Sarah was genuinely happy for her. Then she added that my parents were telling people the surgery was funded thanks to the GoFundMe before it got shut down, still spinning the narrative to make themselves look good. They couldn't admit they'd been caught in a lie, couldn't acknowledge that the transplant list had provided the corneas just like the doctor originally said. Even with Haley getting better, they were still rewriting history to avoid accountability. At my next therapy session, Estelle asked if I wanted to try writing a letter to my parents that I'd never send, just to process everything I was feeling. I'd been resistant to the idea before, thinking it was pointless to write to people who'd never read it, but something had shifted after talking with Sarah. I sat at my kitchen table that night with my laptop and started typing. The letter grew to 10 pages, single-spaced, saying everything I'd never been able to tell them. I wrote about the childhood I deserved, where my needs mattered as much as Haley's, where I wasn't just the healthy kid who existed to support my sister. I described the relationship we could have had if they'd been capable of honesty and basic respect. I listed specific memories of being overlooked, minimized, expected to sacrifice without question. I explained how the cornea scheme wasn't an isolated incident, but the final proof of a pattern that had existed my entire life. I told them about the damage they'd caused, the therapy I needed to undo their conditioning, the family I'd lost because they chose manipulation over truth. I sobbed through writing all of it, tears dripping onto my keyboard, my chest aching with grief for parents who'd never existed and never would. I brought the printed letter to Travis's apartment the following weekend. He'd offered to help me with what Estelle called a closing ritual, something physical to mark the end of my hope that my parents would ever understand or change. He had a fire going in his fireplace, and I stood there holding those 10 pages, feeling the weight of everything I'd written. Travis asked if I wanted to read any of it aloud, but I shook my head and just started feeding the pages into the flames. They curled and blackened, my words disappearing into ash and smoke. Something about watching them burn felt like releasing the fantasy that they'd ever become the parents I needed, accepting that closure had to come from inside me rather than from them, finally apologizing or taking responsibility. Travis stood next to me until the last page was gone, then handed me a beer and we sat on his couch not talking, just existing in the quiet acceptance that some things couldn't be fixed. Work called me into a meeting the following Tuesday, and I assumed it was about the Henderson project I'd been leading. Instead, my manager Sarah told me they were offering me a promotion to senior coordinator, with more responsibility and a significant pay increase. She said I'd been doing excellent work, showing leadership on difficult projects, and they wanted to invest in my growth with the company. I sat there processing the offer, realizing I was actually in a place to accept it. 6 months ago, I'd been barely functional, crying in bathroom stalls, unable to focus on anything except family drama. Now I was thriving, producing my best work, ready to take on more challenge. I accepted the promotion and thanked Sarah, then took myself out to a nice Italian restaurant that night to celebrate. I ordered wine and pasta and tiramisu, sitting alone at a table by the window, feeling genuinely proud of having a life my family couldn't touch or diminish. The support group met Tuesday evenings in a community center basement that smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. At first I went because Dr. Medina said it would help, but somewhere around week 6 it stopped feeling like homework and started feeling like belonging. There were 8 of us regulars, all dealing with different flavors of family dysfunction, and 2 women in particular became my people. Sarah had been estranged from her parents for 4 years after they tried to force her into an arranged marriage, and Jen's family disowned her for being gay. We started grabbing coffee after meetings, then movies on weekends, then spontaneous texts about nothing important. Sarah made me laugh until I cried telling stories about her disastrous dating life, and Jen had this way of cutting through my guilt spirals with blunt common sense that I desperately needed. They got it in a way my other friends couldn't, the specific grief of losing family you never really had and building something new from scratch. We called ourselves the Island of Misfit Toys, and it was the first time I'd felt like I had sisters who actually showed up for me. My phone buzzed during lunch at work 3 weeks later with a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was Aunt Ruth. Her text was short and careful, saying she'd been doing a lot of thinking since that awful day at my parents' house. She said she realized my parents had manipulated her too, feeding her their version of events and using her to pressure me. She wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness or a relationship, she just wanted me to know she saw the truth now, and she was sorry for her part in what happened. The message ended with her saying she hoped I was doing okay, and she understood if I never wanted to talk to her again. I stared at my phone for a long time, feeling something shift in my chest. It wasn't absolution, and it wasn't reconciliation, but it was acknowledgement, and that mattered more than I'd expected. I texted back a simple thank you for telling me, and we left it at that. No demands, no expectations, just honesty finally breaking through the family fog. October rolled into November, and my cousin Jessica called asking if I wanted to come to Thanksgiving at her place. She said she'd invited a few relatives who'd gotten tired of my parents' drama and wanted a holiday without all the tension and manipulation. I was nervous saying yes, worried it would be awkward or someone would bring up the whole mess, but I also missed having family that felt normal. Emma's apartment was small and crowded with 7 of us crammed around her dining table, but the day was surprisingly easy. We ate too much turkey and argued about football and played board games, and nobody mentioned my parents or Haley or corneas or any of it. My uncle asked about my promotion at work and actually listened to my answer. Emma's kids showed me their Halloween candy stash and tried to teach me TikTok dances. When I left that evening, hugging everyone goodbye and promising to come to Emma's Christmas party, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I could have family without having my parents. The two things weren't the same, and I didn't have to lose one to protect myself from the other. Sarah from support group set me up with her coworker in December. His name was Terry, and he was funny and easy to talk to, and we went on 3 dates before I worked up the nerve to tell him about my family situation. We were at a Thai restaurant, and I just blurted it out between bites of pad Thai, the whole story condensed into 5 minutes of rambling explanation. Terry listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when I finished, he took a sip of his beer and said his own family had issues too. His dad was an alcoholic who'd been in and out of rehab his whole childhood, and his mom enabled it for years before finally leaving. He said he got what it was like to have a complicated background and to choose something better than what you came from. We bonded over having families we couldn't fix, and futures we were building on our own terms, and it felt good to be with someone who understood that some things just were what they were. He didn't try to fix it or judge me or suggest I should give my parents another chance. He just accepted it as part of my story and moved on to asking about my favorite movies. 6 months after that horrible day at my parents' house, the family rights organization asked if I'd facilitate a new support group for young adults dealing with manipulation and coercion. I said yes before I'd fully thought it through, then spent a week panicking about whether I was qualified. But the first meeting, sitting in that circle of 8 nervous 20-somethings, I realized I was good at this. I could spot the manipulation tactics immediately, because I'd lived them. When a girl described her mom's guilt trips, I knew exactly what she meant. When a guy talked about feeling crazy because his family's version of events didn't match reality, I could validate that his perception was trustworthy. I offered practical resources and helped people set boundaries, and reminded them they weren't selfish for protecting themselves. Turning my worst experience into something that helped others felt like alchemy, transforming poison into medicine. After each meeting, I drove home tired but satisfied, like I'd found a way to make meaning out of pain. My phone lit up in late December with a text from Haley. It was a photo of her smiling at the camera, her eyes clear and focused, and the message just said, "I can see again." My heart did something complicated, happy and sad and relieved all at once. I responded with congratulations and told her I was genuinely glad the surgery worked. She sent back a thank you and asked how I was doing, and we had this brief, careful exchange that felt cordial but distant. She didn't apologize for the lies or acknowledge what happened, and I didn't push for it. Maybe someday we could have some kind of relationship, something honest and boundaried and real, but I wasn't holding my breath. For now, cordial felt like enough. The Christmas card arrived 3 days before the holiday, forwarded from my old address. It had a generic winter scene on the front, and inside my parents had written, "Thinking of you during this special season," with both their signatures. No acknowledgement of the past 6 months, no apology, no reference to anything that happened. Just a cheerful card like we were a normal family who'd simply lost touch. I brought it to my next therapy session, and Dr. Medina and I talked about what it meant. She said this was them testing whether I'd rug sweep everything if they just pretended it didn't happen, offering me an easy path back to the family fold if I was willing to ignore reality. We discussed how responding at all would signal that pretending was acceptable, that they could lie and manipulate and then restart the relationship on their terms without ever taking responsibility. I threw the card in my kitchen trash that night and didn't send anything back. The silence felt like its own kind of answer. January brought an unexpected email from the Family Rights Organization. They were expanding their board of directors and wanted to know if I'd be interested in joining. The position would involve strategic planning, fundraising, and helping shape programs for people experiencing family trauma and coercion. Accepting felt like claiming a new identity, not just as someone who'd survived family manipulation, but as someone actively working to help others do the same. My story had purpose now beyond just being something awful that happened to me. It was a resource, a roadmap, proof that you could trust yourself and set boundaries and build a life that felt good. I filled out the application that night and got the acceptance call 2 weeks later. At the first board meeting, introducing myself to the other directors, I felt like I'd found my people in a completely different way than the support group. These were people who'd turned their pain into action, who'd decided their experiences should mean something. Travis came over for dinner in February and told me he was proud of how far I'd come. We were eating takeout pizza on my couch, and he just said it out of nowhere. looking at me with this expression that was fond and a little amazed. I realized sitting there that I was proud of myself too. I'd trusted my own perception when my entire family told me I was wrong. I'd maintained boundaries despite constant pressure and guilt and threats. I'd built a support system from scratch, found a therapist, joined groups, made friends who actually showed up for me. I was genuinely happy in my daily life, doing work I cared about and dating someone kind and facilitating groups, and having Thanksgiving with cousins who respected me. The family I was born into didn't define me anymore. They were just people I used to know who'd made choices I couldn't accept, and I'd made the choice to build something better without them. Terry and I had been dating for 4 months when he asked about meeting my family. We were at his apartment watching a movie and he said it casually, like it was the natural next step. I paused the movie and turned to face him, my heart beating faster, and told him the truth. I was estranged from my parents and it was permanent, not a phase or a fight we'd eventually get over, but a decision I'd made to protect myself from people who couldn't be honest or respectful. I waited for him to get weird about it, to suggest I was overreacting or that family was family, and I should try harder. Instead, he asked what I needed from him regarding that. Did I want him to avoid the topic completely? Or was I okay discussing it sometimes? Or did I need him to run interference if they ever showed up? I sat there feeling something warm spread through my chest because this was what healthy looked like. Someone who respected my boundaries without trying to fix or judge the situation, who asked what I needed instead of telling me what I should do. I leaned over and kissed him, then explained that I might need support sometimes, but mostly I just needed him to accept it as part of my reality. He said that was easy, he could do that, and we went back to watching the movie with my head on his shoulder and my hand in his. I started apartment hunting in March, scrolling through listings during my lunch breaks, and imagining spaces that felt like mine instead of just places I lived. The lease on my current place was up in 2 months, and I wanted something bigger, somewhere I could have people over without feeling cramped, somewhere I could paint the walls if I wanted to without asking permission. I found a 1-bedroom with hardwood floors and big windows in a neighborhood I'd always liked, 20 minutes from work and close to the coffee shop where my support group met. The rent was higher than what I'd been paying, but my promotion covered it, and signing the lease felt like claiming something. I didn't tell my parents my new address when I filled out the change of address forms at the post office. The physical distance matched the emotional distance, 3 hours of highway plus an unlisted apartment number they'd never have. Moving day was hot and chaotic, Travis and Terry and my support group friends showing up with their cars to help load boxes. We made a pizza party out of unpacking, sitting on my new couch eating delivery while my friend Jenna hung curtains and Terry assembled my bookshelf. The apartment filled with laughter and stupid jokes and people who actually showed up when they said they would. And I realized this was what home felt like. Not the house I grew up in, but this space I'd chosen, full of people who respected and valued me without conditions. 1 year after the confrontation, I pitched an essay to an online magazine that specialized in personal narratives about family dynamics. I used a pen name, Cassandra Mills, to protect my privacy, but I wrote about everything: the fake surgery scheme, the manipulation tactics, the process of breaking free. The editor accepted it within a week, and seeing my words published made the whole nightmare feel like it had purpose beyond just being something awful that happened to me. The piece went live on a Tuesday morning, and by that evening the comments section had filled with hundreds of responses. People shared their own stories of family coercion, medical manipulation, being pressured to sacrifice their bodies or futures for relatives who refused to consider alternatives. Someone's mother had tried to force them to donate a kidney using similar tactics. Another person's family had lied about a sibling's cancer diagnosis to guilt them into giving money. I read through the comments with tears streaming down my face, amazed and horrified by how many families operated exactly like mine did. How many people had been gaslit and manipulated and made to feel selfish for having boundaries about their own bodies. My cousin called me in April with news that surprised me. Haley had started seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in disability adjustment and family systems, and apparently she'd begun examining her own role in what happened. My cousin said Haley had mentioned me in one of their recent conversations, acknowledging that the surgery scheme had been wrong, and that she should have questioned it more instead of going along with our parents' plan. I felt something cautious and complicated hearing this, not quite hope, but maybe the distant possibility of it. I wasn't ready to reach out yet, wasn't sure I'd ever be ready, but knowing Haley was working on herself made future reconciliation feel possible without being required. Maybe someday we'd talk about what happened. Maybe we'd find some version of a relationship that didn't involve manipulation or guilt, but I didn't need that to be okay. Didn't need her understanding to validate my choices. I sat in my apartment on a Friday night in May, surrounded by the people who'd become my chosen family. Terry was in the kitchen making his famous pasta sauce. Travis was arguing with Jenna about some movie, and 2 friends from my support group were setting the table for dinner. We were celebrating my promotion to senior coordinator and my 1-year anniversary of setting boundaries, a double celebration that felt significant. I looked around at these people who showed up for me, who respected my decisions, who never made me prove my worth through sacrifice, and realized I was genuinely happy. My parents still hadn't apologized or taken accountability, probably never would. Some relatives still thought I was the villain who abandoned my disabled sister, and I'd accepted that their opinion didn't define my reality. I'd never have the family I wanted growing up, the parents who prioritized honesty and respect, the sister who chose integrity over manipulation. But I had the life I built, the peace I fought for, the self-respect that came from refusing to be manipulated into giving up pieces of myself. That was enough.